All right, hey Stat 113 people. So we are gonna get started with this section 1 introduction to data. This section is pretty short, and just as a reminder, like it said in an earlier announcement, you can print out these note packets on Sakai if you would like, and that's kind of what I would recommend you do, just because there are some examples that have kind of fairly lengthy text. But if it's your preference, you could also just take notes on just regular lined paper. All right, so we're going to start with just a definition of statistics. And so we're going to define this as just the science of collecting, organizing, describing, graphing, and interpreting data. So pretty much statistics is all about data and what you can do with it. Just as kind of an overarching view of kind of like where we're headed in this class, we're going to start out by talking about collecting and organizing. So that's what we're going to do first. Then maybe about week 2 or week 3-ish, we're going to move into describing and graphing data. So that's what we're going to do second. And then for the rest of the semester, which is kind of the great majority, the big chunk, what we're going to do is talk about interpreting data, whether that's through more formal statistical analysis or whether that's just interpreting our graphs and descriptions. Okay, so we're going to start with just an example from our textbook that involves answering this question: does the use of stents reduce the risk of having a stroke? And so stents, like, I'm not a biologist, but I picture them like if you kind of like have your little blood vessel thing. I picture a stent as something that kind of just gets put in, that kind of pushes the diameter of the vessel out. So it pushes that out, it pushes that out. So the idea is that it increases blood flow and might reduce the risk of stroke. Again, that's probably more incorrect than correct, but I think that gets across the general idea. And so I'll give you like 10 or 15 seconds or so to go ahead and read through this. And if you don't have time to read through the entire thing, then you can go ahead and pause the video. Okay, so kind of like a couple of important things that we'll talk about a little bit later. But we have this idea that we have all these volunteer patients and we're randomly assigning them to one of the two groups. So one group is going to get the stent, the other is just going to get the standard medical treatment without the stent. And so we've got kind of a couple definitions that we're going to talk about. And so the treatment group, it's really just as it sounds. It's just the group. Really, it's like the group that receives the treatment, but to define treatment, we're going to say it's the group that receives the experimental manipulation in a study. And so in this example, you could take a second to think about which group would be the treatment group in this stent study. And so the treatment group in the stent study is just going to be the group that receives the stent, because they're the ones that are getting kind of this new experimental manipulation. And so they're what would be treatment group. The control group is just the opposite. So the control group is just going to be the group that does not receive the experimental manipulation. And so in our example, you could probably just guess based on context that the control group is, in this case, going to be the group that only receives the medical treatment, or the standard medical treatment. All right, so since it's so topical, you might think of like another example of this type of study where if there's kind of a new treatment for COVID-19, they might evaluate that treatment in a study by giving like half of the study participants that particular treatment and giving the other half just whatever is currently standard in order to evaluate whether that new treatment is actually effective. And so, kind of getting into the results of this study, we've got 224 people in the treatment group and 227 people in the control group. And what the researchers end up measuring is how many patients in each group had a stroke at the end of the first year. And so we've got some results. We've got, of these 224 that got the stent, 45 had a stroke. So we've got that. And of the 227 in the control group without the stent, 28 had a stroke. So this is kind of like a simple data summarization, is that we could calculate the proportion of people in each group who had a stroke. So in the group with the stent, that's 45 divided by 224. So the proportion of people who ended up getting a stroke in that group is about 0.2. For the control group, a similar calculation gives us 0.12. And so take kind of a second to pause the video and think about what some possible conclusions are to the study. So if you don't want to kind of write in this big space, I mean, you can write in the big space if you want to, or you can write on the margins. But wherever you want to write, just jot down a couple of possible conclusions, and then we'll talk about some of them in a second. Okay, did you actually pause the video and do it? Sure you did. So I guess I'm just going to give some of the possible conclusions that I have thought of. So perhaps we actually see that having the stent resulted in this study in a higher proportion of people who had a stroke. And so one possible conclusion is maybe that having the stent actually increases the probability that someone gets a stroke. And so that's one possible conclusion. Again, we don't really have the tools to formally analyze this yet, but that is a possibility. A second possibility, which we're really going to focus on later in the semester, is that the stent just has no effect at all. And so the idea behind this one is just by random chance, there's a difference in the sample proportions. So again, this is something we're really going to focus on later. This idea that it could be just random chance, kind of like flipping a coin idea, that we ended up with this difference in proportions, and maybe the stent doesn't do anything at all. A kind of third thing that I had thought of was maybe we can't make any conclusions because our sample was just volunteers. And so the idea behind this one is just, well, like, what if volunteers are different than regular patients? And so this is another idea that we're going to come back to a little bit later, is if we have a statistical study, um, can we generalize our conclusions to like all patients or can we not? A lot of times that isn't clear. Okay, and so if you have any questions about any of this, you can either shoot me an email, come to office hours, or just hold on to your question until we meet in person. And I do apologize, I'm trying to keep these under 10-minute videos. This one, I think I got a little carried away, so you'll have to excuse me on that. But other than that, I hope you have a great morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time you're watching this video in.